Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are watching this webinar. My name is Mariano Rupertus. I am member of the Communications Committee of the IPA, and I will be moderating this webinar named Rainbow Families. I am glad to count on two excellent speakers today, Jack Drescher and Patricia Gerovici. As you know, psychoanalysis has had a particular social jurisdiction to speak of sexuality, childhood, and family life. Sigmund Freud created a theory about human nature, while Oedipical relationships are fundamental. For several years, psychoanalysis had seen the need to review the use and consequences of its main categories. The Rainbow Families put heteronormative logic into question. Conservative sectors accuse this family configuration of abnormality and declared that the LGTB plus population would be far from the parameters of raising children. In this webinar, two psychoanalyst experts on the subject will reflect on how the Freudian field can contribute to the social discussion of the issue, reviewing the use and consequences of their theories. Before handing over the presentation of our panelists, I will explain briefly the format of how this webinar is going to function. It was two sections. The first section, each of our two panelists will be 15-minute presentation. The second section is a question and answer portion devoted to the free exchange of selected question and idea with the panelists and attendants. You will find a question box in the right side of the screen. If you would like to ask a question, please write in this box. You can post your question throughout the whole course of the webinar from the very beginning. Please remember that question will not be answered until after all presentation from the panelists have been completed. I want to thank Monica Bomba and Silvia Baumbuch for helping me handle the question. Now we are ready to begin. Our first panelist is Jack Drescher with this work, Gay Parenting and Political, Religious, and Scientific Context. Jack Drescher, medical doctor, is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. Dr. Drescher is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, Bayelos College, and physician and surgeons, and faculty member of Columbia's Division of Gender, Sexuality, and Health. He is a senior psychoanalytic consultant at Columbia's Center for Psychoanalytic Research and Training and adjunct professor in the New York University postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. He is supervising and training analyst at the William Alanson White Institute. Dr. Drescher is author of Psychoanalytic Therapy and the Gay Man in Routledge, and editor emeritus of the Journal of the Gay and Lesbian Mental Health. Please, Jack, go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen. I have slides. Let's do that. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to start with some statistics. The Williams Institute in California issued a report in which they said there are more than 700,000 gay families in the United States. About half of them were gay male couples, another half were lesbian couples. Again, about half of them were married couples, and the other half were unmarried but cohabitating couples. And at the time, there were 114,000 couples who were raising children. And then in the United States, the Census Bureau started in recent years, since 2010, also documenting whether gay people were married or not. And so there's more than 500,000 families of married gay couples and almost 500,000 of families headed by unmarried cohabitating gay partners. And here again, 190,000 children who live with gay parents. So what does this mean? Well, first, it means that gay parenting is not a theoretical question, but a fact. And that also the number of families that are headed by gay parents is growing. So contrary to what some people say, this is not a social experiment, but it's actually a way in which people are now living their lives. And whether you like it or not, it's very unlikely that these families are going to disappear. But nevertheless, there's still resistance to gay parenting, and I'll talk a little bit about that resistance. And the forms of resistance include religion, politics, and what we would call pseudoscience. And I'll just touch upon each of them briefly. So Pope Benedict the 16th issued a statement in 2020 last year and said that 100 years ago, it would have been thought absurd to talk about same-sex marriage. Today, those who oppose it are socially excommunicated. And then went on to say that modern society is in the process of formulating what he called an anti-Christian creed, and if one opposes it, one is excommunicated. Pope Francis, on the other hand, took another position. He said that gay people have the right to be in a family, they're children of God and have a right to a family. And he also said that no one should be excluded or rendered unhappy because of this. So what he said is we need to create a law on civil unions, and this way they are legally protected. This, of course, has not changed any official church doctrines, but this at least is the position of the Pope. So there's even arguments going on within the church itself. And in the political arena, as an example, you have the kinds of comments you hear from traditional conservative politicians. This is Matteo Salvini, in Italy, of the Lega, who says that he believes in liberty always, and therefore I believe everyone has a right to love who they wish, to kiss whom they wish, to live with whom they wish, without discrimination on the street, in the schools, at work, wherever. I guess this is his libertarian perspective. But the only belief which I will never change regards children. I will never agree with gay adoption and quote unquote rented uteruses. Children need a mother and a father. And this is a very common refrain that we hear, particularly in the realm of what we could call pseudoscience. And unfortunately, pseudoscience is sometimes quoted by prominent people. For example, Giovanni Corsello, who was the president of the Italian Pediatric Society, made the following public statement that research shows that living in a family without a mother or father figure can harm children. And that clinical studies and research have shown that these processes of what he calls harmonious psychoaffective maturation can be uncertain and weaken even within a conflicted heterosexual family, but also in a family which does not have a father and mother as role models. So is it a scientific fact that a child needs a mother and a father to develop normally? And the answer is no, not at all, because there is research, lots of research. So here in the United States, early research was done in the 1970s of women who had left their heterosexual marriages and then raised their children with their lesbian partners. Significant amount of that research was done by Martha Kirkpatrick, who was in California and was also a psychoanalyst. And this led, eventually, by the 1990s, we saw what was called the gay baby boom or the gayby boom, where gay men and women who had not been in heterosexual marriages began to have children, either as single parents or as part of a gay couple. And they relied upon adoption, maternal surrogacy, artificial insemination, and in vitro fertilization. There is one very important study, the National Longitudinal Lesbian Family Study, which has been following children of the sexual minority parents, that is, lesbian mothers, from conception into adulthood. It was initiated in 1986 and has a 92% retention rate to date. And the study has been examining the social, psychological, and emotional development of the children, as well as the dynamics of planned lesbian families. And it is the longest and largest prospective survey of lesbian mothers and their children in the United States. And these are some of the publications that the group has put out. The most recent one, I believe, was 2019. I have some quotes from that. Now, one of the things that people get all worked up about with this issue is whether gay parents, quote unquote, make their children gay. And the question is, why does this question matter? Well, it doesn't matter to many people on the progressive left, but for the right, religious or otherwise, this is an unacceptable outcome. So the national study, this study addressed that question. They looked at 76 young adults who they've been following for 25 years, and they compared them to 76 same-age cohorts from another national survey of family growth. And so what did they find? They said there were 152 subjects, about half were women, and 90.8% identified as white, and a small minority, less than 10%, identified as persons of color. Almost all of them had some university schooling, not all had graduated. And the majority of subjects in both samples identified themselves as either heterosexual or straight. And compared to their matched counterparts in the population-based survey, the female and male children of lesbian parents were significantly more likely to report same-sex attraction, sexual minority identity, and same-sex experience. So the findings suggest that the adult children of planned lesbian families may be more likely than their peers to demonstrate diversity in sexual attraction, identity, and expression. But what are professional organizations saying about that? Well, I can only speak for the United States, where all of these organizations, the pediatricians, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the sociologists, and even the American Psychoanalytic Association have all issued position statements since 2002. You can see the almost 20 years ago, citing this research in support of same-sex families. And just to give an example of what this position, I'm just using the position statement of the American Psychiatric Association that says that numerous studies over the last 3 decades consistently demonstrate that children raised by gay or lesbian parents exhibit the same level of emotional, cognitive, social, and sexual functioning as children raised by heterosexual parents. And this research indicates that optimal development for children is based not on the sexual orientation of the parents, but on stable attachments to committed and nurturing adults. And the most important piece of information that comes from the research is that it shows that children who have 2 parents, regardless of the parent's sexual orientations, do better than children with only 1 parent. So what of psychoanalysis? I realize, we haven't talked about psychoanalysis yet, because what does psychoanalysis have to say? So psychoanalysis is burdened by its own theories. Particularly one theory is the Oedipus complex, which is presumed by many psychoanalysts to be universal. And with the positive resolution of the Oedipal complex is thought to lead to the development of a heterosexual man, while the negative resolution leads to the development of a homosexual male. And of course, positive and negative are certainly completely neutral terms from psychoanalysis. The late Ken Lewes, who passed away, unfortunately, of COVID last year, wrote a brilliant book. I put the title there because I think everybody should read this book. Dr. Lewes was a very proud Freudian, but he was also a gay man who came up with the notion that there were actually 12 different outcomes to the Oedipal complex, 6 of which led to a homosexual resolution, and 6 of which led to a heterosexual resolution. I apologize for the siren in the background. I'm in New York. The Oedipus complex could be thought of as an official story, which presumes universality. And of course, as an official story, it can obscure individuality, because official stories all too often legitimize only one path of development, and they can create preferential developmental hierarchies. Just as I said earlier, positive resolution and negative resolution is already a hierarchical development. And these stories can also come across as authoritarian and disrespectful, as in the theory that gay people are developmentally arrested or fixated at a pre-Oedipal state of development. Now, belief in the centrality of the Oedipus complex often resembles identification seen in religious and political groups. There are psychoanalysts who believe that if you don't believe in the centrality of the Oedipus complex, you're not really a psychoanalyst. People say these kinds of things all the time. Yet the arguments of these believers really do resemble the ancient debates about whether God is a singular entity or a trinity, and what you believe defines you as either a person of faith or a heretic. But when we get to the realm of science, no one has ever demonstrated in any manner that approaches a modern scientific method the existence of an Oedipus complex, or that it is universal. And psychoanalytic formulations in an effort to explain gay parented families often reflect ideological, religious, or political opinions, not scientific ones. So what about the future? So I'd like to repeat what I said at the beginning. One, that gay parenting is not a theoretical question, but a fact, that the number of families headed by gay parents continues to grow, that this is not a social experiment, but a way in which people are now living their lives, and it's very unlikely that these families are going to disappear. So what are the challenges then? And this includes to we psychoanalysts. One is to do research. How do you improve the lives of these families and stop worrying about whether they make their children gay? Another challenge is in social policy. How do we create rights for people, not take them away? You need to think very carefully if you support any government action to take away a person's rights. And finally, for psychoanalysts, how do we come up with new formulations of development that reflect contemporary findings of scientific research regarding gender and sexuality, rather than a theory that was developed in the 19th century? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack, for your presentation. And thank you. Let me introduce you to Patricia Gerovici with the title, Does the Father Needs to Be a Man? Trans Embodiments and Parenthood. Patricia Gerovici, PhD, is a psychoanalyst and recipient of the Award of the Clinical and Scholarly Work with Latin and Gender Variant Communities. She's a co-founder and director of Philadelphia Lacan Group of an Associated Faculty Psychoanalytic Studies Minor, University of Pennsylvania. Honorary member at IPA and founder member of Das Ubenhangen. Her single authored books include The Puerto Rican Syndrome, Please Select Your Gender, From the Invention of Hysteria and Democratizing of Transgenderism, and Transgender Psychoanalysis and Lacanian Perspective of Sexual Difference. She edited with Mania Stockkoller, Lacan of Madness, Yes You Can't, and Lacan Psychoanalysis and Comedy. And thank you very much. This is your time, Patricia. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mariano, and thank you for the invitation to join this important conversation. I think that is somehow overdue for psychoanalysis. I would like to continue what Jack had presented, that I think is important to, for us psychoanalysts, we have an ethical responsibility to assume a history of pathologization of expressions of gender and sexuality that had been labeled as non-normative, and that I would argue are in a way going against psychoanalytic theory, that in a way this position that historically psychoanalysis has sustained, I consider it anti-psychoanalytic. Unless maybe use the psychoanalytic tools to question, and one interesting point raised by Jack's talk was, a child in a family to grow up in a healthy way would need two parents. So what is this recipe for health and success in life? What is this? What are those functions? Those parents, a mother, a father. So I will ask the question of, what is a father? What is the relationship between a man who impregnates a woman, a male parent, a founding patriot, the head of an organized crime family, and he, the one up there in the clouds, who hears our prayers, the Heavenly Father. Pater semper incertus es. The father is always uncertain, says the Latin saying, while the mother is certissima. Well, we know very well that these ideas have been challenged, this principle of maternal certainty that is dependent on a woman's childbearing capacities may have been useful for several centuries until maybe perhaps 1978, when the techniques of in vitro fertilization allow for an egg to be fertilized outside the human body. So these evolving methods of assisted reproduction problematize a simple notion of paternity and kinship more generally, with modern reproductive technology that is able to harvest and freeze sperm, eggs, and embryos, use embryos from donors, and in some cases, employ a gestational carrier. Current IVF methods allow a gestational surrogate to carry an embryo to birth without having any genetic ties to the baby. Thus, children conceived and gestated with assisted reproduction may have, for instance, three mothers, a genetic one, a natural or birth mother, and a third one who will raise them. As for the father's identity, thanks to new DNA analysis technologies, biological paternity can perhaps be more clearly established. But is a father just a genitor? In ancient Rome, for instance, the father being a father involved acting like one. The Roman father played a pivotal role maintaining order, both publicly and privately, and as such was quite different from the Greek father who was absent from family life. He had absolute power over his children throughout their lives, the right to arrange marriages or forced divorce. He could abandon a newborn child. He could disown, sell, or even kill his children. The Roman father assumed his patria potestas, the father's power, not because of biological kinship, but as the result of a formal social act. The father held his son, was the chosen one, were always male, in his arm and lift him into the skies to indicate his desire to take on the paternal responsibility. His progeny was not treated equally. For a daughter, for instance, he simply ordered that she be fed. In this sense, in ancient Rome, all true fatherhood was a ritualized adoption of a legal obligation rather than a simple biological destiny. In the present, in a time of assisted reproduction, sperm banks, and families with same-sex parents, why do we hold on to the notion of father? Sigmund Freud elevated Sophocles' Oedipus Rex tragedy to a universal model of psychic organization, mentioned by Jack, the idea of the Oedipus complex as a primer of healthy subjectivity, and gave in that fiction, because it's, after all, is taken from literature, it's a model borrowed from literature, so it's a work of fiction. He gives to this setup, this framework, he gives to the father a main but complex role, not only in the family, but most importantly in the family romance. He saw a son's love for his mother and his jealousy for the father as a universal event in childhood. Freud generalized this milestone, positing the father as the one against which the child experiences the first murderous wishes. The child loves mommy too much, becomes envious of daddy, and wants to kill him. The Oedipus complex is, we may say, a father complex. Well, what about the daughter? Freud's Oedipal complex may explain, perhaps, certain types of male development, male sexual development, but leaves the question of why girls would love men and not their mothers. That question remains unanswered. But let's maybe focus on another role ascribed to the father, according to the Freudian elaboration, is that children of any gender would take this father that I want to introduce as a father function. And in a way, my question is, does that I title these words I want to share with you today as, does the father need to be a male? And the answer clearly no, because the father is simply a function of someone or something that represents the law, an agency that lays down a law bit of sexual difference, of the prohibition of incest, or the loss of language. The father or the father function is a function of a diplomat, is an agent of a metaphor. The father obviously is not an individual, but a principle of separation. It's a fourth term that breaks down what psychoanalysis has described so far as the mother-child phallus triangle. The child of any gender will have to renounce the mother, and also the mother, and I mean mother as the main caretaker. That doesn't have to be neither a female nor an actual mother, as we saw before in the context of the kind of modern world in which we are living. Is simply a function that intervenes as a representative of a law to which they themselves have to be subjected. And it's important that the father needs to be limited by this law and recognized by the main caretaker as a holder of this principle. So the father is simply a function to introduce the double dimension of privation and promise, of renunciation and substitution. And also another element of this father function that I see very important and with a very pertinent clinical importance is, as Freud puts it, the father becomes, quote, the mortal vehicle of a possible immortal substance. So according to this, the father function could allow us to give true meaning to the experience of death, that is through this that it can, maybe we can assume our reality as mortal beings, and eventually develop the wish to reproduce and bring children to earth. I think it's important to reiterate, for this function to be fulfilled, whether or not the father is a male figure is totally secondary. And I think clearly the father is not a person, not a gender, but a position as an agent of separation, what in some versions of psychoanalysis would be called castration. And we clearly see castration here as a metaphor, has nothing to do with any bodily organ, but with the encounter with a prohibition, with a limit, with a renunciation. So in a way, this father function would be a knot that fastens drives and cultural conventions. So again, I insist on this. Does a father need to be a man? Or let's rephrase it, the father does not need to be a man, because this is extremely relevant when examining families with non-binary gender, whose orientation may resist the traditional forms of classification. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the father is no more than a figure, freeing this role from associations with sex assigned at birth. And I think it's important to maintain this stance as psychoanalysts, because otherwise we could be holders of a position that is clearly hostile for patients who may not be identifying according to usual norms of gender and sexuality, for instance, a trans patient, a transgender patient. And here I want us to be reminded that even though there is this shameful, I would admit, history in psychoanalysis of pathologizing non-normative expression of gender and sexuality, we have to remember that Freud never considered same-sex desire as pathological, that for Freud, homosexuality was a sexual orientation as contingent as any other, that in a way the question we should pose ourselves is not so much why does someone become homosexual. We may also pose the question, how does someone become heterosexual? Both questions remain unanswered from a psychoanalytic perspective. I think it's important, if I mention this sad history of pathologization of non-normative expression of gender and sexuality, you may know that, for instance, in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association decreed that homosexuality was not a mental health disorder, but it took 20 more years for the American psychoanalytic to stop discriminating. So I think it's important to see, on the other hand, what make me feel optimistic about the future of psychoanalysis. We see, for instance, that in 2019, during Gay Pride Month, the American Psychoanalytic Association apologized for previously treating homosexuality as a mental illness. And now maybe the moment would be to extend that to perhaps revising the theories that could continue silently this terrible heritage of pathologization. So I would argue today, let's depathologize all these expressions by maybe questioning those foundational, supposedly theoretical pillars of how we conduct our practice. So for that, I would like maybe to conclude with a call for maybe a reinvention of psychoanalysis, that maybe it is about time for psychoanalysis to undergo a transition in which it would go back maybe to forgotten chapters in the history of psychoanalysis. And I was very surprised happily surprised doing research on the forgotten trans history of psychoanalysis, when I noted that in the early days of psychoanalysis, Freud was in close proximity collaborating with what was then the emerging field of sexology, and he closely collaborated with a figure that was an important advocate for LGBTQ rights, and I refer to Magnus Hirschfeld, who played an important role, not only publishing early texts of Freud, but also he was one of the founders of one of the first psychoanalytic associations in the world, the Berlin Psychoanalytic. And I'm going back to 1908. And in 1911, when he joined the third international meeting of the psychoanalytic, it was when the IPA was not yet founded. He was received by Freud very warmly as the authority in Berlin on homosexuality. And happily, this wonderful and promising beginning that was important for Freud, of the collaboration between the discourses of psychoanalysis and the emerging field of sexology, was cut short. The accounts are contradictory. It seems that Jung opposed the open homosexuality of Hirschfeld and also his political activism, and this diversion started. And maybe today, we may say, December 3rd, 2021 would be the moment to pick up and maybe go back to that interrupted collaboration, that interrupted dialogue in which the fields of the early work on sexology, the early discourse on transgender studies, and psychoanalysis were collaborating so closely that we need to end this dehumanizing history of prejudice in psychoanalysis. And maybe this is about time for psychoanalysis to start a transition, and why not undergo a sex change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your presentation. Thank you both, Jack and Patricia, because helping us to start to discuss about an important topic in our field, you know. And I want to invite you to feel free to discuss the concepts and idea that you consider relevant to continue and deep, and then give the option to the public to formulating their question and trying to answer. But I want to put one idea for start to talking about it. For their presentation, it's possible to put the concept of resistance to work. You know, it's a concept psychoanalytic itself, resistance. Jack talking about how pseudoscience and religion are opposed, and the case of Patricia in her presentation declared the similar ideas about the future of psychoanalysis, even though the evidence is there but is denied. How when you start to think it within psychoanalysis, into psychoanalysis, how can this idea can influence the psychoanalytic training, especially, because one thing is start to thinking what happened with psychoanalysis outside of the psychoanalytic world, but how do you think about into the psychoanalytic world, about the impact of this evidence?
I'm not sure this is the answer to the question, but I find myself frequently a critic of the way psychoanalysis is taught. And so psychoanalysis is taught with people. You have to start with Freud. But I mean, there aren't many fields like psychoanalysis where, let's say, when you're studying biology, that you have to read everything that Darwin wrote. But somehow, for some reason, we have to know everything that Freud wrote first, and then we have to decide whether we agree or we don't agree with Freud. And since many psychoanalytic institutes choose their students, their candidates, based on their willingness to submit to the authority of the teacher, because if you're in psychoanalytic training and you disagree with something that your teacher says, then you have to have more analysis. That is a typical response in most training centers. So this really makes it hard for people to bring new information into a field which is preoccupied with its history. And of course, this is a side of that, because of course, as analysts, we are very preoccupied with history of ourselves and our own analyses, and with our patients and their analyses and therapies. But as a field, the development of psychoanalytic institutes, Freud wanted psychoanalytic institutes to be independent of the university. And this is what it costs to be independent of the university. The standards of keeping up with modern thinking, it doesn't exist in psychoanalytic institutes, because you don't have to keep up, because there is no university checking in on you. You just have your fellow analysts. And if you disagree with your fellow analysts, you go and form your own psychoanalytic institute with your own theories, and so there's no way to sort of integrate all the different points of view. So this is some of my, I don't know if that answers your question, Mariano, but I think that's my view on the subject.
So maybe to add to Jack's comment, I would maybe follow a quote of Jacques Lacan, who said that there is only one resistance in psychoanalysis, the analyst's resistance. Yes. And in a way, my own development was, I think, what happened to me is that I started hearing things in my own practice that forced me to rethink. I was in a way surprised to have to delve into the troubled waters of identity politics, but guided by what the analyses themselves were bringing as material. And in a way, the foundation of psychoanalysis, if psychoanalysis works with a fundamental rule that is say whatever comes to mind, is supposedly a frame that allows the analysand to suspend any sort of prejudice and censoring of whatever they will bring as material in the session, but also operates for the analyst. The analyst should bracket off any preconception, any prejudice, and we don't have to forget that the current notions that we have of what is normal and what's pathological are all constructed, and they have a history, and they are social conventions. So I think it's, in a way, the fundamental rule gives us a tool that protects us as practitioners from our own mistakes by suspending, in a way, we even suspend knowledge. When we meet for the first time an analysand, we don't really know much about that person, and we need to be educated by whatever they bring of their personal history, of what they may or may not present as a symptom. So in a way, certain technical elements of psychoanalysis itself could be protected. It's interesting what Jack says of the history of institutions. I think, unhappily, the institutionalization of psychoanalysis at times was organized in such a way that contradicted psychoanalytic ethics or psychoanalytic theory as well. And I would maybe disagree with Jack. I think that one could read Freud in a very normative way, and many people have done it to horrible effects. And one could have a very conservative normative reading of Freud. But also I find, and this is my way of reading Freud, I find a sort of pink Freud, a Freud that could allow for a non-normative, way more free and more open clinical practice. And this is something that people in queer studies have done. For instance, they have gone back to an early text of Freud, the Three Axes on Sexuality, and had made the reading of the notion of the drive as non-normative, in the sense that the sexual drive is skewed, is queer, we may say, and doesn't have any predetermined object. The object may or may not be gender, but the real object of the sexual drive would be satisfaction, and as such would skew all attempt at a normalization of the practice. So I think that I agree with you that historically there has been a horrible tendency to find, because Freud had left such a big amount of material, that one could find in Freud very maybe anti-feminist statements like femininity as the dark continent, maybe very complicated material, but could also, if one makes a different reading of the text, find a more a kind of potential for a different kind of psychoanalytic theory that would definitely affect the practice.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Jack. I have.
Jack, I just want to respond to a couple of things. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So I was intrigued. Patricia, I think one of the things that where we disagree is in our interpretation of what Freud actually believed. For example, you gave the example of his relationship with Magnus Hirschfeld. This is a quote of Freud from a letter he wrote to Carl Jung in 1911 about Magnus Hirschfeld. And Freud says, Magnus Hirschfeld has left our ranks in Berlin, no great loss. He's a flabby, unappetizing fellow, absolutely incapable of learning anything. Of course, he takes your remarks, Jung's remarks at the Congress as a pretext. Homosexual touchiness, not worth a tear. So that's, that's Freud on Magnus Hirschfeld, the last word. But that's not the last word, because then Freud then begins to, Magnus Hirschfeld was a proponent of the gay rights movement of his time, which was called the third sex movement. And in the third sex movement, Freud begins to criticize it, first in a footnote in the 3 essays in 1914, in which he says psychoanalysis is opposed to separating off homosexuals as a group of special character. This is his attack on Hirschfeld. And then in his psychogenesis case in 1920, he attacks even further, saying that if nature in a freakish, the theory that nature in a freakish mood created a third sex falls to the ground. So, and then there are other quotes from Freud. I will go to it. So I definitely agree that reading Freud is very important. I personally enjoy reading Freud very much and still do. But I was talking about the way Freud is used to inculcate. And you're right, you can, there's a kind of a normative approach to doing that. So I just wanted to respond along those lines, because we cannot judge Freud by the times we live in today. He lived in a different time and the issues were different, and maybe he would have been on the conservative side, or maybe he would have been on the progressive side today. We don't know. He was progressive for his time. He signed a petition to decriminalize homosexuality in Austria and Germany. So we know that he didn't think it should be treated as a crime. But that doesn't mean that he was gay affirmative in the way we think about it today. And we shouldn't ask him to be, because he couldn't be, because it's a different culture. So anyway, that was just, I wanted to respond to that.
Yes, I agree with you on the history. He was extremely offended by the fact that Hirschfeld left the Berlin Psychoanalytic, and as he did with many of his close followers, he even exchanged rings with him. So we could talk about the homosexuality, the repressed homosexuality of Freud as well, which is a very interesting. I received 2 days ago a book that deals with that, and haven't had a chance to read it yet. But I think that, but you use an interesting word. One should not judge Freud. I find certain propositions of Freud also problematic, as I mentioned, the ones on feminine sexuality. And we could maybe in another occasion discuss the issue of the third sex that has to do with his development, initial support of the theory of psychic bisexuality that he constructed with Fliess, and then he takes distance from that theory of bisexuality. And one may say that he opposed the idea of a third sex because he doesn't believe in bisexuality, he doesn't believe in sexual complementarity. And that one big difference with Hirschfeld and the idea of the third sex is that Freud maintains a non-biological basis for homosexuality, which was the position of somebody like Hirschfeld, Ulrich, Steinach. So he took distance from that. And indeed, there is a lot of drama and mistakes in the history of psychoanalysis. I think one of the things we are discussing today is we should not repeat another psychoanalytic concept. Mariano mentioned resistance. We should try to stop the compulsion to repetition. I think, Jack, is good that you remind us of history. I find always looking at the history of psychoanalysis a good way of trying to learn from our mistakes. And it's what we are saying today. That would allow to go back then to the contributions of early psychoanalysis, and the history of those mistakes to learn and try to reinvent psychoanalysis. I think that the challenge we have facing the psychoanalysis of the future would be that we need to also, for instance, Freud never talked about race, and today it would be impossible to continue working in psychoanalysis without taking into account gender, sexuality, and race. So I think it's important to assume that past, reread it from today, which is the only place from which we can work, and maybe learn from that experience.
Okay, colleagues, I have many questions from the public, but before continuing our discussion, I forgot to mention something important. As a webinar is an open space for debate, all our ideas, including me, not necessarily represent the opinion of the IPA. I want to put this topic because it's important. The first questions from the public is why the Oedipical process is not universal, and eventually what's wrong with the formulation of the Oedipal complex. We are in the middle of discussing now, but what do you think about it? Because this point put psychoanalysis in tension, especially with anthropologists, from the early years of psychoanalysis history, this point is critical about the suppose of the universion of Oedipus complex. What do you think about it today?
Well, I think what I said in my presentation, where has it been proven that this is universal? I don't think other disciplines have supported the idea that Oedipal complexes exist in all cultures. And there are many different ways that families evolve, not just in terms of same-sex families, but, families where there, you don't have what we think of as the Western world's modern nuclear family. So I find the question interesting. It's like, why is it not universal? Well, I think that the burden of proof is on the people who believe that it is universal, not for the people, because that's quite an amazing statement to make. Now, you can say that and get away with that in your first year of analytic training. You'll probably please your teachers and your supervisors, but if you take that outside the analytic bubble, how would you prove that to somebody who wasn't an analyst, that it was universal?
Yeah.
And that's my response.
Okay.
Yeah, many of the criticisms to the model of the Oedipal complex is that it seems to be a primer that repeats an heterosexual, patriarchal model that could be oppressive. So I think, and there have been many objections, there have been very many elaborations already in the 60s, 70s by feminists who had challenged this. If we take the Oedipus complex as a primer of what a family should look like, is not very helpful. We could try to maybe think, what does the claim universality of the Oedipus complex represent? And from that, what I take from the Oedipus complex is that, and is the tension that psychoanalysis has all the time between working on the singular, because psychoanalysis is a practice of the case-by-case situation, and we then jump onto a universal claim. Everyone needs to go through a good Oedipal complex to succeed in life or become a healthy being. And what I take as a useful tool clinically, and to think about the questions that are brought by the clinical practice, is that we could take this myth, this frame, as a primer by which a subject enters a certain, it's how a subject enters culture. How, and it's again, it's mythical because we're always in culture. There's no way outside culture. But that there is something that it has been called the Oedipus complex that has to do with the existence of a prohibition, with a connection with culture, society, that a separation from the moment in which all drives would be mythically satisfied, to entering culture, language, codes, that has to do with how a little piece of flesh born into the world becomes a person. So in that sense, the Oedipus complex we can extrapolate. But again, I agree with Jack. I think the key is not to adopt a religious position. Yeah. That psychoanalysis, if psychoanalysis becomes a religion, stops being psychoanalysis. And that reminds me, Jean-Luc Nancy, the philosopher, was saying that psychoanalysis as a discipline would be the last purely atheist discipline, but with the problem that a psychoanalyst, or a good psychoanalyst, would be so such non-believers that they don't believe in psychoanalysis itself. So I think if psychoanalysis believes in itself, should then comply with the scientific requirements of a solid discipline that Jack was referring to, that if it's all boils down to politics within an institution and pleasing the teacher that happens to be teaching me this or that course, the discipline as a system of thought will not go too long, and is following the precepts of a religion, not of a scientific discipline. I think that scienticity has to do with maybe what we are doing today, having debates, questioning ideas, and adopting this scientific position that has to do with maybe let's take the Oedipus complex as a problem, like they do in philosophy, and think about it to come up with tentative answers that for us have a very practical application is the clinic. I think problems that we have the amazing lack, and I think we are very fortunate as practitioners, we are constantly being taught psychoanalysis by analysis. It happened from the invention of psychoanalysis when the early hysterics would lie on the couch and tell Freud how to improve the technique. So if we maintain that position of being completely open to be constantly proved wrong and rectifying, reinventing psychoanalysis every session in every clinical encounter. And I think that's what makes a fun our activity, that we are in a way reinventing psychoanalysis, and the expert there is the analysand, who always will know better.
It is very interesting because your discussion helping us to understand what is the position of psychoanalysis between science and religion. You know, for a side, it's possible to think that we are psychoanalysts. I am, you know, share scientific theories, but the attitude of permanent, critical position for us is necessary to go ahead for receive the new frames for another fields, and in that sense, I have another question from the public. We are talking about homo and heterosexuality, but what about the complex and heterogeneous panorama? For example, how would you explain the surge in non-binary identities? It is because some people don't identify with the societal norms and gender, or a more complex inner crisis. What do you think about it? It's not only homosexual and heterosexual sexualities.
Well, I just wrote, I was asked to write an opinion piece for the British Journal of Psychiatry Bulletin in response to another opinion by a British analyst called Marcus Evans, who was up in arms and very panicked about the increase in, in non-binary gender identities. Excuse me. And what I wrote and what I can say here is we don't know. We don't know why this is happening. We just know that it is happening. So there are lots of opinions. If many parents whose children are having this are blaming the internet, that that there's access for people to learn about other ways of thinking about their gender and their identities in a way that was less likely, and when we didn't have the internet and communities were not interconnected with each other the way they are now. So that's a possibility. I don't know. I have a colleague, David Lopez. We were on a panel together. Well, it was a meeting in Florence last month. He was in Florence and I was on Zoom for the OPAFER conference. And he gave a very interesting presentation. He's a child psychiatrist and analyst, and he sees a lot of adolescents who are appearing with non-binary gender identities or raising issues about gender identity, to their families, which are concerning their families. And he did a set of slides which were very interesting. He showed a slide of James Dean as Rebel Without a Cause in the 1950s, hippies in the 1960s, Mohawks in the 1970s. And he said that for some children, we don't think all children, but he thinks for some children, gender is the way to play with gender is a way to disidentify with parents in the way that adolescents often need to do. That is to set themselves apart and create their own identities, which is different from the parents. And I think that's sometimes possible. I often consult with parents whose adolescent or young adult child has come out as non-binary or transgender. And I explain to the parents, that they really need to learn about something they never wanted to learn about, that it was really important for them to know more than their 15-year-old child did. And if this issue was simply a matter of opposition, the parents enthusiastically learning about the subject would likely lessen some of the opposition, because if it only is for oppositional purposes, if the parents get on board and learn about it and discuss it, it's not going to work as an oppositional thing in some cases. But I'll get back to the main answer is we don't know why these numbers are increasing for sure. Nobody's actually produced any research to that effect.
Patricia?
Well, in a way, I think psychoanalysis has always dealt with the sexuality, and human sexuality is something about which we don't know, as Jack said. That's why, unlike animals who could rely on the instructions, pre-programmed instructions given by instinct, for humans is a much more complicated issue, to the point that we need to get sex ed to be taught what we should have known altogether, and that dealing with sexuality, sex identifications, assumption of gender is always complicated. That one of the important things I learned working with trans-identify analysis is that in a way they allow us to enrich and reorient the practice, because in a way their experience makes perhaps more prevalent, for instance, that we need to assume our bodies. We are the bodies we inhabit are not bodies we are born into, bodies that have a gender assigned at birth before the child could even speak. That often the assumption of a body that is not only gender, that has sexuality, but is also mortal, is a process of becoming a body. And this is something that the trans experience teaches us, but applies to anyone, trans or cis, that in a way these expressions of non-binarism in a way shows that sexuality is in a way always fail for speaking beings, that we are always at an impasse. And from the early days, one thing that Freud discovered is that behind those opaque symptoms for which traditional medicine did not have an answer or reliable treatment or an effective treatment, that for those persons to speak about those symptoms reveal a truth that had some sexual component behind. And there was the seduction theory first that then was abandoned, but that psychoanalysis has always dealt with sexuality. But the paradox is that it's a sexuality that Freud had been, for instance, accused of pansexualism, but the irony is that it could be found anywhere, but we can never truly say what it is about, how it is, how do we live with it, that sexuality has always this traumatic, disruptive quality, and that we need to eventually learn to live with, and we will find our different symptomatic solutions to sexual embodiment, sexual orientation. But all these issues are constantly problematic for humans. It's not such a simple matter, as we know very well, because in a way, that's a lot of what we hear in our practice, that there is something at the level of sexuality that never works very well. It's either too much or not enough, arrives too early or too late. When it's delightful, it's too much delight. When then it's not enough. So there is always this excess and this deficit. And psychoanalysis has a precise and original way of intervening in this discontent in culture.
Okay, thank you. When I listen to you, I think all the time when I was thinking that the transformation of psychoanalysis from a psychopathological theory about a mental ill like hysteria give us the option to understand the human nature based on sexuality, and the born of psychoanalysis like an anthropological theory. And when you discuss about this topic, give us maybe the option to understand that psychoanalysis give a second chance to reconfigure itself when we'll be able to recognize all the different sexualities in that sense, the different options that separated for aside the biological discussions. Because do you remember, for became a psychoanalyst, you need to be a doctor for many years. The biological, field, closed the door for another disciplines. And today is different. Well, third question, please. What do you think about the role of the family besides of the mother, the father, and the baby, and the role of the group of its dynamics in the development of the children? What do you think about it?
A good question. Since the first thing that popped into my head, of course, is the notion that from an object relations perspective, is that that people are influenced not just by the parents in their growth and their development. That if you listen to the clinical material with any patient that you work with, you're going to meet a whole host of people who had an impact and an influence on a particular child. You'll meet the grandparents, the siblings, the aunts and uncles, the neighbors, the teachers. There are lots of people who play an important role in the development of children. Or as Hillary Clinton put it once, it takes a village to raise a child. So one should never dismiss the importance. The notion that you have to, if you're seeing a patient and you have to formulate down to, well, what is the Oedipal, issue here, or where does this patient stand in relationship to my theory of Oedipal development? you're really missing out on a much more complex way of thinking about a person who is always, in communication with an internal world that is filled with many, many people, some more important than others, but there are many people to meet and to know. And so I think it's very important, who is involved, in a person's upbringing, because one way or another, and it will vary from individual to individual, they will have an impact on that person.
Yes.
Yes, and I think we may need to keep in mind that the contemporary model of the family is just a convention in the present time, that what is taken as the Oedipal model is a relatively recent model of family. I was referring in my presentation to the Greek family, the Roman family. In the lab, maybe if we go back to the invention of the Oedipus complex, we are talking about a Victorian family that is not the same as the family we have now on the 21st century. But still, I agree with Jack that it's important to see who are those important players in the erotic life, and erotic in an extended sense. Those left an imprint in this person that we have in our office, talking to us and ascribing to us the position of psychoanalyst with whom we are conducting a treatment. And that in the same way that we need to have open ears to see who were the important people, who were the ones they expected to be loved by and they were not, who were the ones who left marks, who were invested with the position of being ideals or negative or positive, so that we will, I think, in a way we have, and once more, we have always the possibility of reinvent the practice and actualize and improve and update by letting ourselves be guided by what our analysis bring as material, trying to put aside all our preconceptions, because and that's the way we will be able to learn new things and push the theory further. That what Jack was saying, I think, made me think that one should never try to apply the Oedipus complex, this model, to the analysis. And it's like, rather, what question is this analysis I'm bringing? How could I think of them? Is the theory I'm ascribing to, that hopefully will not be working as a religion, helping me answer those questions or not? So then if my theory doesn't work, then I have to question the theory, not assume that the problem is on the side of the analysis. And that's how psychoanalysis will continue live and will have a future. And one thing that occurred to me with what we were saying before is that we should not forget, we were talking about maybe the time of the nuclear family and the binary identification may be gone, and now teenagers, I hear that a lot in the practice, don't want to talk about gender or feel that gender is a form of oppression. So they want to identify themselves outside that model, neither as male nor as female, but something else altogether. That it's important to know that all these complications, all these difficulties posed by sexuality in speaking beings is also an element that is foundational, that allows for the creation of the unconscious, that the unconscious results for this disruption in our incapacity, this unknowable aspect in our subjectivity, that's what creates the unconscious. And that psychoanalysis has this unique form of intervention, because it's a practice that takes existence, but I think that would be, I wouldn't say a belief, but it's a sort of a hypothesis of the unconscious. We have the hypothesis of the existence of an unconscious realm of psychic life, and we work with that. And there, when we are in the unconscious, identities fall. Whether or not someone identifies as this, that, bi, poly, male, female, extreme right, extreme left, that in the truth of the unconscious, the truth of the subject challenges all these forms of conscious identities. And this is where psychoanalysis is most effective and where the emancipatory power of psychoanalysis resides.
Okay, you already answered different point of view for this question that I just saying, but an important concept of psychoanalysis that currently used to understand very of what happened with our patient, for example, is primary identifications. No, from this point of view, it's necessary to understand maybe from another framework what happened with the primary identification. What do you think about it? But it's not only, you know, you understand the thing is start to complicate it. One thing is Oedipical complex, but I think the primary identification is a, you know, a prominent concept into psychoanalysis. What do you think?
Yeah, it's not very prominent in my work, really. You know, honestly, I don't. I mean, so that's what I think. I mean, it's not my way of thinking about it. It's not important to me to think about, because if I'm talking about a primary identification, I'm already establishing a hierarchy regarding, you know, my hierarchy, you know, imposed on the patient, and so, like, again, if you're listening to the patient talking about themselves and their lives, you know, I'm hearing many identifications going on, and it doesn't really matter necessarily which one is the primary one. I don't know what purpose that serves. It does serve a purpose in the Oedipal developmental theory, because the theory says you're supposed to identify with the parent of the same sex and reproduce the next generation by doing so. So that's why it matters there, because Freud is trying to solve in a Darwinian way, you know, how our psychology develops to help our anatomy and our reproductive capacity. But if that is not your operating theory, then there is no necessity for primary identification. But I also read, you know, aspects, you know, someone had written to counter biologically based homosexuality and transsexuality, should we rethink the definition of primary identification? I just wanted to say to the questioner, I'm not saying here that biology is the cause of homosexuality or transsexuality, because the answer to the question is, and I speak as someone who some people think is an expert, we don't know what causes people to be homosexual or heterosexual. We don't know what causes people to be transgender or cisgender. That is still an open question. And the question for psychoanalysts is, if you think you're going to answer the question by talking to a person in your studio, that's not going to happen. That's what we call epistemological confusion. The method that you're using is not going to answer the question. It's just going to come up with a story that suits you and your patient. So you have to ask yourself the question, why does it matter? Why does the why question matter? Because the real question for patients, and I think for analysts to help patients with, is not why am I gay or why am I transgender, but how do I live my life as a gay person, or how do I live my life as a transgender person? So to move from why to how is really what we're talking about, the shift. Because if you're spending all your time with the why, you're just wasting your time and the patient's time. Heterosexual patients do not come into analysis to find out why they're heterosexual. Cisgender patients do not come into analysis to find out why they're cisgender. And they don't, because those are not stigmatized identities. People only ask the why question because they're dealing with a stigmatized identity, and somewhere they read along the line that psychoanalysts somehow know the answer to this question, and we don't. That's all I got to say on that one.
Thank you, Jack.
And to continue this idea of how to live rather than why, and I think to go back to primary identifications. Identifications are always partials, that they're identifications often to a trait, not to a whole person. For instance, if we go back to the classic cases, Freudian cases, Dora was in love with Mrs. K, loving Mrs. K as a man. So was Dora lesbian? Could an heterosexual woman love another woman like a man would? So all these I think when one looks closely at the clinical truth, it's hard to maintain. I think the old identitary claims collapse when one looks at the unconscious psychic dimension of an experience. But I want to return to something very important. Just said how to live, because that I think could be translated as the ethical responsibility of psychoanalysis. When I work with the trans-identify analysis, initially I was maybe too caught up in questions of gender, sexuality, so binary, non-binary, and in a way I felt that I neglected to notice something that became more and more clear in recent years, is that, for instance, when a trans person says, if I would not have transitioned, I would have killed myself, that in fact, behind an issue of gender, there is a question, is not gender, is not sexuality, is life or death. And that, in fact, that's where psychoanalysis has a unique role to play, because then it is about finding life more livable. And for instance, in the trans community, we have, and this is again, I agree with Jack, is society makes people sick. Nobody will come to an analyst to complain about being heterosexual. They will complain that they're not happy with their partner, or whether or not they want to be in a polyamorous arrangement or monogamous. There will be other forms of discontent, but within a form of being in the world that is sanctioned as acceptable by society. Those who have other forms of living their sexuality may find their lives impossible, not livable. And the percentage of suicide among the trans-identified population before and after transition is around 41%. For the general population, and I have information about the US, is around 4%. So 41% versus 4%. So we have an urgent responsibility as clinicians, when we may have a trans-identify analysis come into our practice, to focus on this, how to accompany an analysis to make life livable. And I think this is a responsibility we have. We will put aside prejudice that will be, I think, a deadly effect. We are on the side of the death drive, and let's try to be on the side of life and help populations that, because of the way our society has been functioning so far, could find their lives as not livable. And I think this is important, that these are, I think, the real questions we should pose ourselves in terms of our responsibility as practitioners.
Okay, we have two questions for start to finish. This is interesting discuss, colleagues, but the time is limited. As regards the adolescents questioning binarism, are they rebelling against what, in your opinion? Are they maybe ahead of all of us? Maybe they are a new breed of the human, not in need of simplistic split black-white male-female?
I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
For me, the question put the adolescent, maybe the teenagers, more sensitive to understand the many possibilities of the sexualities, and the question put for us why the grow up persons talking about sexuality, but maybe the sensibilities, came from the teenagers or adolescents. What do you think about it?
If I can jump in, I think the idea of binary is a construction. For instance, Anne Faustus Sterling, who is a medical anthropologist, so is not a psychoanalyst, has taught us, created a lot of scandal that has been around for at least 20 years, is that we know, thanks to the contributions of feminism, that gender is a social construction, but sex too. If we take sex as the biological rock that is the truth of an anatomical destiny, we know that that's also a construction. There are at least 5 genders, not 2. So in a way, what the new generations may be aware is that these constructions that held us in our systems of belief no longer hold. And now, unhappily, I think what is important is that maybe new systems of belief will be created. And what we are trying to talk about is that maybe psychoanalysis intervenes from a different perspective by questioning all forms of belief that could be alienating, that could be causing suffering, could be causing symptoms, and could, for some people, make life not livable. And I think this is important, that we could take, and I think I say that to supervisees, that I take everything that is said during the session like a dream. Whether or not they are talking about what happened that day, and they're very faithful to the successions of events of the day, that if we take everything that is brought to the session like a dream, there is no principle of contradiction, and everything could be an invitation for free association, like we do with a dream. And that would be with the aim of revealing a truth, an unconscious truth, that will give to that person a little bit of freedom. And that could only happen if we suspend all our beliefs or all our prejudices.
So I have had a chance to read the question myself. So thank you for that question. I don't know exactly what adolescents rebel against, but there's certainly a lot of developmental literature that demonstrates that rebellion against parental beliefs and restrictions is part of the development of a separate identity. But adolescence, as we currently conceptualize it, is complicated because I always use the metaphor in talking to patients, like, you know, the adolescent goes into their room in their parents' house and slams the door and says, "Stay out of my room." You know, but their room is not their real room. It's a room in their parents' house. So it's that difficult time when one is both dependent and trying to develop autonomy from the parents. So that is what I think of as the adolescent rebellion. And I was intrigued by David Lopez's, suggestion that people are using gender as a way to do that. So what they rebel against are really just parental authority in general, and they find the thing that can trigger their parents. That would be his way of saying it. I don't think that's true of everybody, but that's a reasonable way to think about it. I don't think we're dealing with a new breed of humans, which is what the questioner asked. I don't think so, but it did make me think about the work of Kohlberg, who did child development work, and Kohlberg's work shows that children learn how the world works in binaries. That our first way of thinking as we grow up is to learn the difference between big and small, black and white, and opposites. And so the development of non-binary thinking is a later achievement, within our human psychology. And so why it's playing out again, I speak to a lot of journalists. They don't like when experts say, "I don't know," but I don't know, and I think the thing that's the most helpful to us as analysts when we're working with, as an analyst, as an expert, as, someone who speaks to the public, "I don't know" is a really important thing to learn how to say when you don't really know. I can offer an opinion, but I don't know that my opinion is true. So if I believe in Oedipal complex, that's just my opinion. It's not it's not a truth. Just something I think about. It might be a useful way to think about it, but that doesn't make it true. So that's the best I can do. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we have 5 minutes. I want to apologize to the public because we come with many of interest questions to continue and discuss about it, but the time is up. I want to thank you, all the people that connect with us today, and everyone, their participation, especially Patricia and Jack. Thank you very much for your ideas, your stimulating, statement for us for trying to reconsider the classic position about sexualities, and thank you very much for your participation. Let me announce the next webinar, and the next webinar will be, thank you. The upcoming webinar will be 28 January 2022 under the title Rebirth and Hope. And in the next week, we started with the publicity about this important topic too. Thank you very much. Again, I say
Thank
goodbye.
you, Mariano. Thank you for this opportunity to work productively without not knowing. I like what Jack was saying, like to put not knowing to work in a very productive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mariano. Thank you, Patricia. It's good to see everybody. And thank you to the audience for coming. It was nice. It's good to be here. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, there was a question about the LinkedIn group.
Oh, yes. Give me a moment. I lost.
It's on the screen. I think it's on the screen. The
And
link discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. Join our discussion group about what psychoanalysis can contribute to discussions by and about LGBTQ+ issues. Search for psychoanalytic perspective of gender and sexual diversity on LinkedIn. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye. Wow.